Daniel sat back in his chair, his eyes still fixed on Emily as she walked away, her steps purposeful, as though she knew something he didn't. The confusion lingered in his mind, but a strange feeling started to bubble beneath the surface. Could she really know something about the drink? Could he actually be in danger? He had faced business negotiations with billion-dollar stakes, dodged corporate attacks, and built an empire from the ground up. Yet here he was, second-guessing himself over a waitress's warning. He took a deep breath and placed the glass back down on the table. The ice was melting, water dripping slowly down the side, and for some reason, that simple action felt monumental. His phone buzzed on the table, snapping him out of his thoughts. It was a text from his assistant, reminding him of a conference call he had in 15 minutes. He glanced at the glass one last time before picking up the phone and texting back, then looked around the room, distracted. The restaurant was still buzzing with laughter and chatter, yet everything seemed distant now, like a film playing on a screen too far away to touch. As he typed the response, he heard footsteps approaching, and he looked up to see Emily standing near his table again. She wasn't looking at him. Instead, she was watching the door, her eyes scanning the room. "Is there something you need?" he asked, his voice tinged with a mix of curiosity and frustration. Emily didn't respond right away. She kept her gaze locked on the entrance, her posture tense. Then, she looked at him, and her expression had changed. It was no longer just the concern of a waitress. There was something else, something deeper. "It's not the drink," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "It's the person who gave it to you." Daniel frowned, unsure of what she meant. "What do you mean? Who gave it to me?" he asked, his mind racing. Emily's gaze darted briefly to a man sitting at a corner booth, a tall figure who had been observing Daniel since he walked in. The man's face was partially obscured by the shadows, but there was no mistaking the sharpness of his eyes, the way they narrowed when they landed on Daniel. "Him," Emily whispered, almost too softly for him to hear. "He's not who he says he is." Daniel turned his head, following her line of sight. The man in the corner booth was still watching him, his expression unreadable, but there was something unsettling about the way he sat. Too still, too focused. The hairs on the back of Daniel's neck stood up, a feeling of unease creeping over him. "What's his deal?" he asked, his voice lowering. Emily didn't answer right away. She took a step closer to the table, glancing around one more time, as if to make sure no one was listening. "He's been following you," she said, her voice tight with restraint. "Not just here, but for a while now." Daniel's heart skipped a beat. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice rising slightly. Emily nodded. "I'm sure." The silence between them stretched, thick and heavy. Daniel could feel the weight of her words settling in. This wasn't just a coincidence. Someone had been tracking him. But why? And why was Emily the one to know? "What do I do now?" he asked, the question hanging in the air. Emily's eyes softened for a moment, but her resolve didn't falter. "Stay calm," she said, her tone steady, reassuring. "We need to get you out of here quietly. Trust me on this." Daniel hesitated, then nodded. He didn't know what was happening, but there was something about Emily, something in her eyes, that made him believe her. As he stood up and followed her toward the back of the restaurant, his mind raced. What was really going on? Who was this man? And why was Emily, of all people, the one to warn him? The night had just taken a sharp turn, and Daniel knew things were about to get a lot more complicated. As Daniel followed Emily through the crowded restaurant, the weight of the situation pressed down on him. The soft murmur of conversations, the clinking of glasses, and the faint hum of music all seemed so distant now, as if they were in a different world. Emily moved with quiet urgency, her steps measured, yet purposeful. She glanced over her shoulder, making sure Daniel was still behind her, her eyes scanning every corner of the room. They reached a narrow hallway that led to the back entrance. Emily stopped just short of the door, her hand on the handle. "Stay close," she whispered. Daniel didn't question her. The unease that had settled in his chest from the moment she spoke to him was now a suffocating presence. He watched as Emily pushed open the door, just a crack, peering out into the alleyway beyond. The cold night air hit him immediately, the smell of damp concrete mixing with the distant scent of car exhaust. He felt a surge of panic but fought to keep it in check. He had been in high-stakes meetings, faced business threats that could ruin companies. But this was different. The threat wasn't corporate. It wasn't financial. It was personal. "Who is this guy?" he finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Emily hesitated before replying, her eyes never leaving the alley. He's been following you for weeks, watching your every move. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. What do you mean, watching? What's he after? Emily's grip on the door tightened as she took a step closer to him. I don't know, but he's dangerous. He's not just some random person. He knows things about you, things no one should know. Daniel's mind raced, the pieces of the puzzle slowly starting to click together. Why are you telling me this? He asked, confused. She turned to face him then, her eyes dark with concern. Because I know who he is, and I think he's trying to get close to you. He's been posing as someone he's not. Daniel frowned. He was used to dealing with deception, but this felt different, more sinister. What does he want with me? He pressed, his voice sharper now. Emily looked at him with a mixture of frustration and caution. I don't know yet, but I'm not going to let him hurt you. I've seen enough to know when someone's out for more than just a business deal. There was a brief pause before she spoke again, her tone softening. Look, I'm not asking you to trust me completely, but you need to leave now. He's not far behind. I'll take care of this, but you need to go, and you need to go now. Daniel felt a surge of uncertainty. He had always prided himself on being in control, but now he was standing in the dark, relying on a waitress to help him. It felt absurd, but as he looked into her eyes, he saw the same resolve that had driven him to the top. She wasn't afraid, and that gave him a strange sense of comfort. Okay, he said, his voice steady, though his heart was still pounding. Let's go. Emily nodded, her eyes flicking once more toward the alley. She opened the door wider, gesturing for him to step outside. As Daniel stepped into the cold night air, he felt the weight of his decision settle around him. What was really going on? Who was this man, and what did he want with him? And more importantly, how had Emily become involved in all of this? The answers weren't clear, but one thing was, he was in deeper than he ever expected. As they walked briskly down the alley, Emily led him to a black SUV parked at the end. She opened the passenger door and waited for him to get in. He hesitated for only a moment before slipping into the seat. The door shut behind him with a solid thud, and he couldn't help but feel like he was stepping into a different world. Emily slid into the driver's seat and started the engine. Without a word, she pulled away from the curb and into the night. The headlights illuminated the road ahead, but the darkness beyond seemed to stretch endlessly, like an unknown threat waiting to reveal itself. Daniel leaned back in his seat, his mind spinning with questions. Where are we going? He asked after a long silence. Emily didn't immediately answer. Her focus was on the road, her hands gripping the steering wheel with a tightness that made her knuckles white. I'll take you somewhere safe, she finally said, her voice calm but laced with urgency. We need to figure out who this guy is, but we can't do it in the open. Daniel nodded, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. His world had just shifted in ways he couldn't quite comprehend, and he didn't know what would happen next. But one thing was certain, he couldn't walk away now, not when there was so much at stake. He glanced at Emily, trying to make sense of it all. She was his only ally in this strange, dangerous situation, and he wasn't sure if he could trust her completely, but for now, he had no choice but to follow her lead. The car's engine hummed steadily as Emily drove through the dark streets, the city lights flickering in the rearview mirror. Daniel sat in the passenger seat, his mind racing. The quiet urgency in Emily's movements, her focused expression, was unlike anything he had ever seen before. The fact that she knew so much, that she was involved in this somehow, was both comforting and terrifying. He didn't know whether to trust her completely, but the situation was spiraling too quickly to second-guess now. As they turned onto a quieter street, Daniel broke the silence. What's really going on, Emily? She glanced at him briefly before returning her attention to the road, her hands tight on the steering wheel. I wish I could give you a straight answer, she said, her voice calm, but there was an edge to it that spoke of her own inner tension. But the truth is, we're in deep. That man, the one in the restaurant, he's not just some random stranger. He's got connections, dangerous ones, and he's been watching you for a while now. Daniel's heart skipped a beat. Why me? He asked, his voice quieter now. What does he want? Emily hesitated before answering, her jaw tightening. I don't know yet, but he's after something. And it's not just your money. This is personal. He's been tracking your movements for weeks, and I think he's getting close to making his move. The weight of her words hung heavy in the air, the unease in Daniel's chest growing with every passing second. They turned another corner, the lights of the city now far behind them. It felt like they were heading into the unknown, with only Emily's steady hand guiding them. Daniel's mind raced as he processed the information. This was more than just a business threat. Someone had been tracking him, learning his every move, and now, whatever this was, it was beginning to unfold in a way he didn't fully understand. "How do you know all this?" Daniel asked, his voice still edged with suspicion. Emily's grip on the wheel tightened again. "Because I've been watching too. I know what it's like to be in danger, to feel like your whole life is being watched. I've seen the signs before, and I couldn't let you fall into whatever trap he's setting for you." Daniel looked at her, his mind still clouded with doubt. But there was something about the way she spoke, so sure, so confident, that made him trust her just a little bit more. He didn't know if it was because of the urgency in her voice or the fact that she had just saved him from God knows what at the restaurant. But there was no denying that he was beginning to rely on her more than he ever thought possible. "I don't know if I can trust you fully yet," he admitted, his voice low. "But right now, I don't have much of a choice, do I?" Emily glanced over at him for a moment, her lips curling into a small, knowing smile. "No, you don't," she replied softly, but there was warmth in her tone. "But you will. You have to." The car continued to move through the dark streets, the city now a distant memory in the rearview mirror. Daniel couldn't help but feel the weight of the night settling around him. What had he gotten himself into? And what was it about this mysterious man that had put him in Emily's path? As they pulled up to a nondescript building, Emily stopped the car and turned to him. "We're here," she said quietly, her eyes serious. Daniel stared at the building, a feeling of dread settling in his stomach. It was an old, abandoned-looking building, completely devoid of life. He couldn't help but feel a little uneasy, but there was no going back now. He had already come this far, and whatever was waiting for him inside, he needed to face it head-on. "This is where we'll figure out who he is," Emily said, her voice steady and unwavering. "But we need to be careful. We don't know who's watching." Daniel nodded, his heart pounding. He opened the door and stepped out into the cold night, following Emily as she led the way. The air was still, almost too quiet, and the only sound was the distant hum of the city. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that someone was out there, waiting for the right moment to strike. But for now, the only thing he could do was trust Emily and take the next step into the unknown. Emily led Daniel through the dimly lit hallway, the sound of their footsteps echoing against the walls of the abandoned building. The air was thick with dust, and a faint smell of old wood and metal lingered in the stillness. The place felt deserted, untouched by time, yet there was something unsettling about the silence that enveloped them. As they reached the end of the hallway, Emily paused, her hand on the door handle. She turned to Daniel, her expression serious. "Stay close, and stay quiet," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Daniel nodded, his heart racing. The tension between them was palpable, the uncertainty of the situation creeping into every corner of his mind. He had no idea what they were about to face, but he knew one thing. He had come too far to turn back now. Emily pushed the door open, and they stepped into a small, dimly lit room. The walls were lined with old, dusty shelves, and a single light bulb hung from the ceiling, flickering intermittently. A large table stood in the center of the room, covered with papers and scattered files. Emily moved toward the table, her eyes scanning the contents with a practiced gaze. Daniel followed closely behind, his curiosity growing with each step. "What is all this?" he asked, his voice low, but filled with wonder. Emily didn't answer right away. She rifled through the papers, pulling out a few documents and spreading them across the table. "This is everything we've gathered about him," she said finally, her voice calm but intense. "Everything he's been hiding." Daniel looked down at the papers, his eyes widening as he recognized his own name on some of the documents. This is about me," he said, his voice a mix of disbelief and confusion. "Who is this man?" Emily turned to face him, her eyes filled with determination. "His name is Victor Crane," she said quietly, "and he's been following you for months. He's got connections, powerful ones, and he's been gathering information on you, piece by piece. But what I don't understand is why." Daniel's heart skipped a beat. Victor Crane. The name sounded vaguely familiar, but he couldn't place it. Why me? He asked, his voice tight with uncertainty. What does he want from me? Emily paused, her expression softening for a moment. I don't know, she admitted. But I'm going to find out. She moved to another stack of papers, her fingers flipping through them quickly. Daniel felt a surge of anxiety rise in his chest. He was being dragged into something far bigger than he had ever imagined, and he had no idea how to get out of it. How long have you known about this? He asked, his voice edged with frustration. Emily glanced up at him, her eyes filled with quiet resolve. Longer than you think, she replied. I've been keeping an eye on him for a while now, but I couldn't do anything until I knew you were involved. Daniel stared at her, his mind racing. He had been oblivious to this entire world, this shadowy figure who had been lurking just beyond his reach, watching his every move. And now, he was right in the middle of it. What do we do now? He asked, his voice steady despite the fear bubbling inside him. Emily looked up from the papers, her gaze locking onto his. We keep going, she said simply. We get the answers we need, and we make sure he doesn't get what he's after. Daniel swallowed hard, the weight of her words sinking in. He had no idea what Victor Crane was after, but he knew one thing for sure. He couldn't let this man, whoever he was, get the upper hand. He looked around the room, his mind still spinning. What had he gotten himself into? And what was Emily's role in all of this? She had already proven she could be trusted, but how far would her loyalty stretch? As if reading his thoughts, Emily spoke again, her voice calm but unwavering. We're in this together, Daniel, she said. And we're not backing down. For the first time since this nightmare began, Daniel felt a flicker of hope. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep him going. He nodded, determination settling in his chest. All right, he said. Let's find out who this guy really is. Daniel stood by the table, staring at the scattered papers in front of him. The silence in the room felt almost suffocating, and the weight of the situation seemed to grow heavier with every passing minute. Emily had been going through the files, her movements quick but deliberate, as if she was searching for something specific. Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out, that every moment they spent here brought them one step closer to something dangerous. Emily, he finally said, his voice low. What exactly are we looking for here? I mean, we've got all these documents, but what do we do with them? Emily didn't look up as she continued to flip through the papers, her focus unwavering. We're looking for patterns, connections, she replied, her voice steady. Something that links Victor Crane to the people behind him. We need to understand what he wants, why he's been watching you. Daniel's frustration bubbled to the surface. You're not telling me everything, are you? He pressed. There's something you're not saying, Emily. I don't care about the details right now. I just want to know what's going on. Emily stopped and looked up, her eyes locking with his. There was something in her gaze, a flicker of hesitation, but it quickly vanished. It's not that simple, she said, her voice quiet. Victor Crane is connected to some very powerful people. This isn't just about you. It's about what you know, or rather, what he thinks you know. Daniel frowned, his mind racing. What does that mean? He asked, his voice tight with suspicion. What does he think I know? Emily leaned back in her chair, her expression pensive. Crane thinks you have access to something that could destroy him and the people he's working for. Daniel's heart skipped a beat. What are you talking about? He demanded. What could I possibly have that would do that? Emily's gaze softened as she leaned forward, her hands resting on the table. I'm not entirely sure yet, she admitted. But I think it's tied to something you were working on recently, something to do with your company. A deal, perhaps. A partnership. Daniel's mind flashed to the recent acquisitions and negotiations he had been involved in. His company was in the middle of several high-stakes projects, each one more complex than the last. Could there be something in those files, something buried in the details, that would be of interest to Crane? You think someone from my company is involved in all this? Daniel asked, his voice rising. Is someone close to me working with Crane? Emily's face remained calm, her eyes unwavering as she met his gaze. I don't know yet, she said. But we need to find out. If Crane is after something, we need to know what it is before it's too late. Daniel felt a cold chill run through him. He had worked his entire life to build his company, to make sure everything was above board. The idea that someone in his inner circle might be involved in this conspiracy was almost too much to bear. How do we find out? He asked, his voice low. Emily stood up and began pacing, her mind clearly focused on the task at hand. We dig deeper. We go back to your recent projects. Look at every deal, every contract, every partnership. Someone must have made a mistake, left something behind that can lead us to the truth. Daniel nodded, his mind already racing through the details of his company's most recent deals. I'll do whatever it takes, he said, his voice firm. But I need to know who I'm really dealing with here. Who is Victor Crane, and what's his real goal? Emily stopped pacing and looked at him, her expression more serious than ever. Crane's not just some businessman, she said. He's been part of something much bigger for a long time. And if we don't figure out what he wants from you, we're not going to get out of this unscathed. Daniel swallowed hard, the reality of the situation hitting him square in the chest. He had always believed he could handle anything, that his success in business had given him the upper hand. But this was something he wasn't prepared for, something that was far beyond his control. All right, he said finally, standing up and gathering his thoughts. Let's start going through the files. We'll find the link, whatever it is. Emily nodded, the determination in her eyes never wavering. We'll find it, she said quietly. And when we do, we'll make sure Crane and his people don't get what they want. Daniel and Emily sat in the dimly lit room, the flickering light bulb above casting shadows on the papers scattered across the table. The silence between them was heavy, each of them lost in their own thoughts. Daniel kept replaying the words Emily had said. Someone close to you is involved, she had implied, but he couldn't wrap his mind around it. The idea that someone within his company, someone he trusted, might be working with Crane felt like a betrayal he couldn't yet comprehend. He leaned forward, his elbows on the table, running his fingers through his hair as he tried to piece it all together. How do we even begin to look for a mole? He asked, the frustration evident in his voice. Emily's eyes met his calm, yet intense. We look at everyone, she said, her voice steady. We go back to every project you've been involved in, every business deal. We need to find the common thread, the one thing that connects everything. Daniel nodded, though the idea of going through every contract, every conversation, felt overwhelming. His company was built on trust, and now, in this moment, that trust felt like it had been shattered. What if we're missing something? He asked, the doubt creeping into his voice. Emily paused for a moment, considering his question. It's possible, she said. That's why we need to be thorough. We can't afford to miss any details. Daniel sat back, his mind racing. Every deal, every acquisition, every partnership, he couldn't help but wonder if there had been signs all along, signs he had missed. He had been so focused on growing the company, on expanding his empire, that maybe he hadn't paid enough attention to what was happening behind the scenes. He glanced over at Emily, who was already back at the table, her eyes scanning the papers once again. What's our next step? He asked, his voice firm. Emily looked up from the papers, her expression resolute. We start with your most recent deals. We'll analyze each one and see if there's a pattern. If we're lucky, we'll find something that links Crane to one of your partners, or even one of your employees. Daniel took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. He wasn't used to feeling this vulnerable, to not knowing what the next move would be. But Emily's calm demeanor was a steadying force, even if he didn't fully understand why she had become so involved in all of this. He still didn't know everything about her, her past, her connections, her motivations. But there was something about her that made him trust her, even though he knew he shouldn't be trusting anyone right now. All right, he said, standing up. Let's get to work. They spent the next few hours combing through the files, reviewing contracts and emails, trying to find anything that would connect Crane to the mysterious figure he was working with. It felt like searching for a needle in a haystack, but Daniel couldn't afford to give up. He needed answers. Emily was focused, her eyes sharp as she flipped through the papers. Daniel watched her for a moment, impressed by how methodical she was. She seemed to know exactly what to look for, even when the information didn't make sense. Finally, she stopped on a page, her finger tapping against it as her eyes narrowed. This, she said, her voice steady but urgent. This could be it. Daniel leaned over, looking at the document she was pointing to. It was a contract for a partnership with a tech company he had recently acquired. The terms of the deal seemed straightforward, but there was a clause buried in the fine print that made his stomach turn. The clause referenced a secondary party, someone who was not listed on the official documents, but who had been given access to sensitive company information. Who is this? Daniel asked, his voice tight with suspicion. Emily looked up at him, her expression grim. I don't know yet, but this could be the link we've been looking for. We need to dig deeper into this partnership. Find out who's behind it. Daniel felt a cold sweat break out on the back of his neck. This was it. This was the breakthrough they needed. But it also meant they were one step closer to the truth, and that truth might be more dangerous than he had ever imagined. We'll do whatever it takes, he said, his voice low. But we need to be careful. We don't know who we can trust. Emily nodded, her eyes never leaving the document in front of her. I know, she said quietly. But we're in this together now. And we're not backing down. As Daniel stared at the document in front of him, the weight of the discovery hit him with a force he wasn't prepared for. The partnership contract, innocuous at first glance, now seemed like the key to everything. The secondary party mentioned in the clause, someone with access to sensitive company data, was not a random individual. The name was a shadow, hidden behind layers of red tape, but Daniel could feel it. This was where it all connected. Emily stood beside him, her fingers still on the page, her gaze sharp as ever. This person, Daniel said, his voice tight with growing suspicion, isn't listed anywhere else in the documents. Why would they have access to this kind of information? Emily leaned in, her expression thoughtful. That's what we need to figure out. The fact that their name is buried in the fine print could mean they're trying to cover their tracks. Whoever they are, they're involved in something much bigger than just a business deal. Daniel felt his pulse quicken. He couldn't shake the feeling that this was the moment everything had been building to. The person behind this partnership, the one who had access to all the confidential data, was connected to Crane. There was no doubt in his mind. How do we find out who this is? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Emily turned away from the table and started pacing, her mind already moving through the next steps. We need to look at every connection, every meeting, every email, every phone call related to this deal. Whoever they are, they've been hiding in plain sight. We need to pull them out of the shadows. Daniel stood up, walking over to the window and looking out into the night. The city stretched out before him, a maze of lights and shadows, and for the first time, he felt as though he was a part of something far darker than he could have imagined. I can't believe this, he muttered to himself. All this time, I've been working, building this empire, and there's someone I trusted, who's been playing a game behind my back. Emily stopped pacing and looked at him, her expression softening for a moment. I know it's hard to accept, she said quietly. But right now, we don't have time for doubt. We need to stay focused. We're close, Daniel. I can feel it. He turned to face her, his eyes meeting hers. There was a fire in her gaze that mirrored his own. In that moment, despite the chaos swirling around him, he knew one thing for certain. He couldn't do this without her. You're right, he said, his voice firm. Let's find this person. Let's bring everything into the light. Emily nodded, a small but resolute smile on her face. We'll do it together, she said. The next few hours were a blur of activity as they dug through every scrap of information they had on the deal. Emails, contracts, notes from meetings, they left no stone unturned. Emily's focus was relentless, and Daniel found himself drawn into the process, his mind racing with each new detail they uncovered. Slowly, the pieces began to fit together. It wasn't just one connection, there were several. Small, seemingly insignificant meetings that had taken place under the radar, small shifts in strategy that could now be seen as part of a larger pattern. I think we've found it, Emily said, her voice low but triumphant. Daniel rushed over to where she was pointing on the screen. This is the meeting where everything changed, he said, his voice tinged with disbelief. The name of the mysterious secondary party appeared in the notes. It was a name Daniel had heard before, but never in connection with his business. Victor Crane's name had come up several times, but now, the full extent of his involvement was becoming clear. So, Crane's been pulling the strings all along, Daniel said, his voice dark with realization. But why? What's he after? Emily looked at him, her expression unreadable. He's after control. He's been trying to infiltrate your company for months, using every means at his disposal. This isn't just about money, it's about power. Daniel felt a chill run down his spine. Power. The word echoed in his mind. Everything he had worked for, everything he had built, was now at risk. And the man behind it all had been hiding in plain sight. We need to take action now, he said, his voice firm, a sense of urgency rising within him. We can't let him get away with this. Emily nodded, her eyes narrowing with determination. We won't, but we have to be smart. We need to make sure we're not walking into a trap. Daniel took a deep breath, the weight of the situation settling in. He had always thought he was prepared for anything, but this was something else, something far more dangerous. He glanced at Emily, the one person he trusted in this chaos, and nodded. Let's finish this, he said, his voice steady with resolve. Together, they would find a way to stop Crane, to stop whoever else was involved, and reclaim everything that had been taken from them. The hours blurred as Daniel and Emily worked through the night. The papers, contracts, and emails scattered across the table were more than just documents now. They were pieces of a puzzle, each one bringing them closer to the heart of the mystery. Daniel's mind raced as they uncovered more information, more links between Crane and his associates. But with every discovery, the weight of the situation grew heavier. His company, his empire, was under threat, and the man behind it all, Victor Crane, was still lurking in the shadows. This is it, Emily said, breaking the silence as she pointed to a final document. This is where everything connects. Daniel leaned in, his eyes scanning the page in front of him. The document was a series of communications between Crane and several high-level individuals, all of whom had been involved in his recent dealings. Some were familiar names, people Daniel had met at conferences, partners he had worked with over the years. But there, in the middle of the page, was a name that sent a chill down his spine: Robert Nash. Robert Nash was a trusted senior executive in Daniel's company, someone he had worked closely with for years. The realization hit Daniel like a physical blow. Nash, he whispered, his voice barely audible. How is he involved in this? Emily looked up from the papers, her expression grim. That's the question we need to answer, she said quietly. Nash has been in a position to leak information, to orchestrate deals with Crane's people. And now we know he's been part of this from the beginning. Daniel stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. His thoughts were a jumbled mess, his mind unable to process the betrayal. Robert Nash had been one of the most loyal people in his company. How could he be involved with Crane? How could someone so close to him have turned against everything they had worked for? We need to confront him, Daniel said, his voice shaking with a mix of anger and disbelief. Emily stood up as well, her eyes narrowing. We will, she said, her voice calm but firm. But we need to be smart about it. If Nash is working with Crane, we can't just walk in and accuse him without solid proof. We need a plan. Daniel nodded, taking a deep breath to steady himself. You're right, he said. Let's put everything we've got together. We need to catch him in the act, and we need to do it now before it's too late. The two of them worked quickly, gathering the evidence they had uncovered, piecing together the details that would prove Nash's involvement. The clock was ticking, and Daniel knew they had no time to waste. If Nash was working with Crane, every moment they delayed was another moment the conspiracy could grow stronger. As they finished compiling the information, Daniel felt a new sense of determination rise within him. He had always prided himself on being in control, on having everything planned out. But this was different. Now, he was fighting for everything he had built. Let's go, Daniel said, his voice steely with resolve. Emily nodded, her face set in determination. We'll take care of this, together. They left the room, their steps quick and purposeful as they made their way toward Robert Nash's office. As they reached the door, Daniel felt the tension build inside him. This was it, the moment of truth. He could feel the weight of his choices pressing down on him, but there was no turning back now. He had come this far, and now it was time to confront the truth, no matter how painful it was. Emily turned to him, her eyes calm but resolute. Remember, she said softly, stay focused. This is the moment we've been waiting for. Daniel nodded, taking one final deep breath before they entered Nash's office. The door swung open, and Robert Nash looked up in surprise, his expression unreadable. Daniel, Emily, Nash said, his voice smooth, betraying no hint of guilt. What's going on? Daniel's heart pounded as he stepped forward, the confrontation now unavoidable. We know what you've been doing, Nash, he said, his voice firm, the anger in his chest finally breaking through. You've been working with Victor Crane, and now it's time to pay for what you've done. Nash's eyes flickered for a split second, but the mask remained intact. I don't know what you're talking about, he said, a hint of defensiveness in his tone. But Daniel could see the cracks beginning to form. Emily stepped forward, holding up the stack of documents they had gathered. "We have the proof, Robert," she said, her voice unwavering. "This is where you've been going wrong." Nash's expression faltered for the briefest of moments, but it was enough. The truth was out, and there was no escaping it. Daniel stood tall, his anger giving way to a quiet satisfaction. "You're done," he said, the words hanging in the air as Nash's world began to crumble around him.